Well, as most of you know, we are with Arizona Psychedelic Society here tonight, and we are hosting a very special guest. Andrew Ecker is going to speak. He is an author and a drum circle facilitator. So he's going to enlighten all of you about his knowledge of how the rhythms can make you move.
Thanks, sir. Do you need it for the recording? No. Okay. I think I'm probably pretty good without the mic, right? Everybody okay with that? All right. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. So, Abby. Hey, Abby. Thank you for the invite. And it's a privilege to be here to share with you a little insight that I've cultivated over about, 30 years, I guess it's been, of living in relationship to the use of psychedelic plant medicines, and how that evolution of building that relationship has led me to the person that I am today, which is a nationally recognized mental health speaker, the developer of drumming sounds and evidence-based wellness intervention, and a practitioner of living life successfully, I would say. So before I begin, I'd like to share a traditional introduction in honor of today being Indigenous Peoples Day. So this is an introduction that is used in ceremonies. It's also used as a way of connecting people to each other, and it's a familial-based introduction. So I'm going to share it as best as I can in my traditional language, the language of my ancestors. So Dago De, She Inde, Andrew Ecker Yinishe, Adonna E Nishinigi E, Inde Nishe, Irish Bashachin, Inde Dashanali, Akote Goe E Tishli E, Portland, Oregon Inisha, Shama E Kathy Lindsay Woye, Shaza E Del Ecker Wole. So my name is Andrew Ecker, my mother Kathy Lindsay, my father Dale Ecker. My mother's mother, Elba Gallegos, Apache woman from New Mexico. She grew up in a little town called Capitan, right outside the Mescalero Reservation. Although my ancestral lines go back to the Madera Valley of Texas and Chihuahua, Mexico. The Apaches from this area are called La Pond Band Apache. My father's mother, Evelyn Beatty, an Irish woman from Pennsylvania. She was very proud that our ancestor, William Beatty, fought in the Revolutionary War to establish this country. So I do consider myself a son of the Revolution. My mother's father, Leroy Lindsay, a Korean and Vietnam War veteran, and my father's father, Wayne Ecker, a World War II veteran. I have a daughter, Bailey. I have a son, Peyton. I have a beloved fiance named Monica. I was born in the ancestral land of the Multnomah, Clackamas, and Willamette in Portland, Oregon, although I currently reside here in the ancestral land of the Akmal Atam, the Peeposh, and the Hohokam, here in Phoenix, Arizona. And I'm just very grateful to be here to share with you some insights into my journey to living in functional relationship with psychedelics. Myself, I grew up in a home where both my parents were addicted to drugs. My mom died of a cocaine overdose, and my father died of cirrhosis of the liver caused by hepatitis C. So you could imagine growing up in that environment, some of the things that I was exposed to at a very early age. A lot of violence, a lot of crime. In fact, my earliest memories of being with my mom were out shoplifting to support a cocaine habit. And by the time I was a teenager, I was using heroin with my father intravenously. I grew up in a time when it was just say no to drugs. And I remember the DARE program when I was a kid, getting children to turn in their parents for using cannabis. You know, this was some of the tactics that they were using back then. So I remember one fateful day, my mom kind of pulling me to the side and saying, you know, you can't tell them what we do. Because my job as a young man was to clean the stems and the seeds out of the cannabis. Back when cannabis had stems and seeds, you know, and they called it a joint, not a pre-roll, right? You know, and some of my fondest times were when my family was using cannabis. Because they weren't locked in the bathroom or the bedroom, and they weren't isolating in their disease of substance use. They were actually hanging out with me and being more parental. You know, I learned to play chess in a room filled with the smoke of cannabis. You know, I heard songs being played on the guitar. You know, it was very warm for me, good feelings. And I couldn't imagine a world where that was illegal. But yet this was the reality of my life. So I remember my mom drilling it into me, you know, you can't say anything if they ask you if we use this plant. And I remember them coming into my school, you know, and my little heart racing and my palms getting sweaty. And they had flags and they had guns and they were big police officers, and they came in with this message of just say no. And I remember sitting there thinking, oh, any moment they're going to pull me to the side and interrogate me. Well, thankfully they didn't do that. But they did say to this group of kids, now let me rewind a little bit. My family from New Mexico transplanted to Portland, Oregon, because one uncle got a good job. And then on the same street where I grew up was my great-grandma, my grandma, my mom, my grandpa, my great-aunt, my uncle just down the road. It was like this little enclave of New Mexico green chilies and tortillas. And I remember we lived in a part of Portland that looked like a bunch of VW buses broke down and Harley Davidsons, and they made a tree house. This is Southeast Portland. You know, there are tie-dyes in the windows, and it was, you know, basically a counterculture area. So these police knew this about Southeast Portland, and they came into this group of children and they said, if you have one drug addict parent, you're 50% more likely to become a drug addict. And this was the first time in my life that anyone told me that I was genetically flawed, that I had this preconceived medical condition that was going to lead me down this road of destruction. And I remember feeling this really black cloud, kind of a heaviness fall over me. And it wasn't until many years later that those destructive behaviors began to manifest, but that was really the first time in my life that I accepted an identity. I accepted this identity that was fueled by really not just genetics, but eugenics and the very destructive forces of eugenics. Now I think we're at a phase in our relationship with genetics that we've come to this place of understanding epigenetics, and that's a lot more beneficial for us. And I think also a lot of the causality of the world that we live in with our relationship to substance use disorder. But anyway, as I sat there and felt this darkness kind of, you know, enter into my mind, I remember walking away from that experience and feeling a certain sense of bravery that I didn't say anything, but also kind of a seed that was inside of my heart that was definitely growing. And I remember going to the Navajo Nation, and for my first time in my life hearing a traditional introduction, the introduction that I just shared with all of you, and thinking to myself that maybe this introduction was something that could unravel the influences of a culture that would tell a child that that child was genetically flawed. You know, we live in a culture that's really been influenced by some really powerful, profound architecture, primarily something called manneralism, feudalism, and the patriarchy. You see, these were institutions that created the modern day identity that we associate ourselves with. And this is primarily a behavioral based identity. Hi, my name is Andrew and I'm a drum circle facilitator. Hi, my name is Andrew and I'm an author. Hi, my name is Andrew and I'm a speaker. It's all associated with behavior. Of course, the idea of my parental behaviors being the foundation for my disposition as a genetically flawed person was also woven into that space of identity, in my opinion. So as I began to listen to these indigenous elders introduce themselves, I was invited there to go do a drum circle. And this was at one of the largest hospitals on the Navajo Nation, right outside Fort Defiance. And there was a healers conference that was going on, and it was not just Native Americans that were there for this healers conference. There was all kinds of people there. And I remember after the drum circle, which was an awesome drum circle, and there were hundreds of people drumming, this man came up to me, and his name was Fillmore Bluehouse. And he said, I'd like to invite you back to my hogan. You know, I'm going to do a ceremony there. And you've done something really good here today. And I said, well, that's where I need to be. And I remember sitting in that hogan, and his apprentice sweeping the floor. And he would sprinkle water on the floor, and he'd sweep the dirt. And there was juniper that was burning in the center of that hogan. And I remember for some reason, the smell of that fire burning and the dust in the air gave me a warm, comforting feeling, like I had been there before. And as I sat there were all kinds of people that came into that room. And at the very end, there was a group of elders. There was about 10 elders that came in, and they all sat down next to Fillmore. And you know, those elders only wanted to introduce themselves. That's all they wanted to say, was their introduction. And I remember feeling this profound sensation of, wow, what does that mean? What does that mean to be a child? What does that mean to be a grandchild? What does that mean to be from someplace? I never thought those things were important. In fact, I ran from those things. At this point in my life, I wanted to get away from my parents and their destructive behaviors, and my grandparents and their alcoholism, and all of those things that were a part of my family. So I didn't really know how to associate that into what I would later become an understanding of my true medicine. But as I sat there and I listened to them, that question arose in me. And it took me a while to really understand why that's important. Because you see, I really believe that every one of us here is an earthling. You know, and if we're really going to unpack our relationship with these very intelligent and advanced plants, we need to understand the premise of how we conduct ourselves in their presence. And underneath all of that distortion that came from these very powerful architectures of consciousness, the feudalism, the manneralism, the patriarchy, underneath all that is a wisdom inherent inside of you that's really woven into the fabric of your DNA that says that you are an earthling. Not just indigenous people, as we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day today, but that all of us can have a relationship with these medicines. And at the foundation of that relationship is how we identify ourselves. Understanding this is very important to the causality of ceremonial sacred space. You know, back to that Hogan, the only thing that those elders wanted to do was introduce themselves. Because energetically in that introduction is the profound fortification of the individual. Now you might be saying to yourself something like, well, I use these medicines to eradicate my ego. Well, maybe in the ego is the distortion of a culture that has alienated you from the earth herself. And maybe that, in some sense, is what we're truly eradicating when we think about the distortion of our ego. Because believe me, I've experienced the vomit of my ego in a very heavy LSD trip. You know, myself, I did 3.5 years in prison for selling LSD and mushrooms. And you know, growing up in that environment that I grew up in as a little boy, I can tell you that the United States system was Goliath. I was David, and the stone in my sling was LSD. I would go to raves, go to parties, go to concerts, and every drop that I put on a person's tongue was activating them to bring them out of the illusion of the corruption of the United States government. That's why I was out there working those systems. That's why I was out there selling those substances. Because I was so angry inside that I knew that that tool that took me out of that system could also take others out of it and help them wake up under the confusion of the illusion of the air that they were breathing. It was an anger that was inside of me that was fueling that. It wasn't really a profound relationship or a ceremonial space or even anything sacred. It was just activating people. It was a tool that I was using. And at the same time, that anger was fueling the destruction of my own substance use, because the money that I was getting from selling was going into my arm, was going into the distortion of the destruction of my substance use and all those things. So it was really just a perpetual wheel of anger that was instituted by my parents and their struggle as well. Because both of my parents were 70s hippies that thought that their revolution was in the substances they were using. But I think real revolution comes from the establishment of kindling the fire of what it means to be an earthling. What it means to really restore this relational identity. Many years ago, there were only a few select people that could have an earth-based identity. These people we call landlords. You see, under those systems of the patriarchy, manneralism, and feudalism, this select group of people were the ones that held all of the legislative, all of the governmental, all of the economic power. And they held it because their identity was based around the land. Everyone else was a behavior. And that's why so many people are smiths, Knights, Parsons, right? They have job-based last names. Very few people have last names that are associated with the land. But if you do, most likely, your family was either a very close slave of a landlord, or your family had land title. You see, and this is where the systematic erasure of our identity being associated with the land began. And so why is this important to a conversation about psychedelics? Why is this important to all of you? Well, I really believe that in establishing the relationship that we have to the medicines, we can activate a deep intimacy with these medicines. And in that intimacy, we can really begin to unpack the history of the beauty of the indigenous mindset when it comes to these medicines. You see, there's tens of thousands of years of practice-based evidence inside of the tools that indigenous people have used. And one of those tools is understanding how to introduce yourself to the architecture of the ceremony. Introduce yourself to the medicine. Create a foundation for the experience. You know, why is this important? I think this is important because within this strategic introduction process, this ceremonial introduction process, is really the power to unlock some of the most tragic experiences we have as youth and throughout our existence. Those key influencers in our lives, our parents, our grandparents, the place of our birth, the place of our residence. These are very powerful influencers that really either can help us thrive as healthy individuals or create destructive patterns that we pass on to the future generations. So in becoming relational to that architecture of identity, I've been able to unpack those relationships and create intimacy and boundaries. That's the importance of relationship, right? Is that I can say if I'm living in relationship with this, I'm the one that's responsible for the intimacy to that relationship. I'm also responsible to the boundaries of that relationship. And in that responsibility is the effective navigation. And that effective navigation is really why I hope that we're utilizing these medicines in the first place. Myself today, I can tell you that it's been 26 years since I pulled the needle out of my arm and stopped using. 26 years. I haven't used any substances that have caused me any distorted behaviors. And in those 26 years of living in effective relationship with substances, I can tell you that my evolution of those substances has been very important to developing a safe, sacred space, an intimate ceremonial experience. And this is something as simple as spending time with my breath, creating ceremony with air, creating ceremony with fire, creating ceremony with water, and creating ceremony with the earth. When I start to feel a certain way, if I start to feel uncomfortable, maybe I start to experience something that's really challenging, the first thing I do is introduce myself to the world. I introduce myself to the mountain. I introduce myself to the river. I introduce myself to the experience that I'm having. And I ground myself in the structure of that experience. To understand that you as an earthling have the power to create a ceremonial introduction for your process of living in functional relationship with substances and medicines is a very important catalyst for really awakening a ceremonial space in this contemporary timeline. Many people go to shamanic studies online, they go and take classes, all of these things, but for some reason, these quote-unquote shamanic teachers don't teach people the very first thing that earth-based communities teach their young, and that's how to introduce themselves. Even in Judaism, there's a ceremonial introduction. That's the reason why Jesus was Jesus of Nazareth, and he came from the clan of Judah. You see? Because that ceremonial introduction is important. It's important to every earth-based community. If you go to the Mari, they introduce themselves not only by their grandparents, but also by the river and the mountain of their birth. And yet this is something that's overlooked. And you know why it's overlooked? Because it isn't as fashionable as learning your spirit animal. It isn't as cutesy as understanding your star, because there's real work to be done in understanding how to introduce your mom and your dad and your grandmas and grandpas. To sit with the integrity of that. And then to extend that to the honoring of people that have influenced you in your life. Maybe there's somebody that was a father to you. You know, I've gone to Sweat Lodge and I've had elders introduce me to 6 and 7 dads. Oh, that's my dad. That's my grandma. Because this idea of this very rigid association with parental figures is an illusion within earth-based communities. It's the people that influence you that you honor in that way. So how beautiful it is to have a knowing inside of you that says that I have people that are honoring me energetically in my life and that I'm holding sacred space for when I ingest this medicine. You know how beautiful it is to create an intimacy with the people you love. To look into the eyes of a lover and have them introduce their grandparents to you before you have that act of intimate relationship. How many of us live in this world that is so sad that we've had sexual relationships with people and not even known their parents' names? This is something that doesn't happen in earth-based communities. This doesn't happen in the knowledge base that creates communities that live in functional relationship with people, the planet, animals, the air, the water, the fire, the earth. It's all relational. You know, and at the heart of that is that practice of relational spirituality. And hopefully these medicines can do for people what they did for me. You know, there was a time in my life when I was so afraid I couldn't close my eyes to pray. You know, I'd be in county jail waiting on sentencing and seeing everybody praying for a 10-day sentence or time off or whatever. And I'd look around and see everybody with their eyes closed. And I wasn't able to do that because I was so scared because of my PTSD. You know, today I can close my eyes and take a breath. I can close my eyes and experience the beauty of peace in my life. You know, and the unpacking of the distortion of growing up in a family where both my parents were addicted to drugs and the use of psychedelics, because believe me, when I was out serving this community, LSD and mushrooms, I was using a lot of LSD and mushrooms. A lot. And in that space, those medicines did help me. But they didn't create the intimacy that I found in ceremony that I have today with plants. Today, I can share with you that the smallest amount of medicine, if I get invited to go to a peyote meeting or a ceremony, the smallest amount of the medicine is enough for me to experience the beauty of that prayer. Now maybe you're thinking to yourself, well, all this mystical stuff about prayer and spirituality, I'm just here for the scientific benefits of these medicines. Well, you know what? There's a science to spirituality, a very powerful science that is within the evidence-based practice of these earth-based communities that needs to be addressed inside of the container of our contemporary use of these substances. Or we might as well be a big pharmaceutical company coming to this conversation with the intention of creating a patent. I know that there's a balance in there that we can find, right? A balance between those two worlds. And I understand that maybe it's frustrating because it is a lot to unpack. But in the curiosity of this conversation, I think that there's a deep ethical resolve to understanding that it's important to unpack these things. And to do our best to really begin to create a foundation for the next generations that are coming into a world where we likely may have a world where these substances are free. Free in the sense of them not being criminalized. You know, hopefully that's a world that we're going to move into. I mean, when I was young, they were putting people away for a couple seeds, you know. One of my charges, I went to prison for marijuana, you know, for cannabis. Can you believe that? But that's a reality of where we've been. So where we're going, you know, it is maybe likely that we could be those people that create the conversation for the legalization of this movement. And if that is, I think that it's important that we understand some of these earth-based wisdoms. and somehow incorporate that into our technology. So that's also been something that I feel is important about my relationship to the drum. And I want to share a little bit with you guys about that. Is that okay?
Yep.
Are y'all getting something from this?
Yep.
Okay, good. So I'm a professional drum circle facilitator. So what does that mean? Well, I work primarily in healthcare, facilitating an evidence-based wellness intervention that utilizes recreational drumming based on post-colonial drumming in North America in a place that Choctaw and Chickasaw called Bulbacha. Can you guys say Bulbacha?
Bulbacha.
Meaning the place of many tongues. Later to become the famed city of New Orleans. You see, for the first time in history, Native Americans, Africans, Europeans, and people from all over the world were able to gather with a common language of group drumming. That common language of group drumming created a foundation for the greatest gifts North America has given to the world musically. Jazz, blues, R&B, gospel, and eventually rock and roll came from diverse people, creating a place of inclusion and equity to experience the powerful heartbeat of Mother Earth in the drum. You know what the only truly American instrument is? Oh no, the banjo's from Africa. It's a good answer though. It's the most answered answer also to that question. The only truly American instrument is the jazz drum kit. Isn't that sad that we're not taught that our instrument is a drum? Huh? Isn't that sad? Maybe, just maybe, that might be intentional. Because inside of that space, under French colonial occupation, where an inclusive area was created, and I also might add, it was at a marketplace where the enslaved people sold goods to buy themselves out of slavery. At one point in New Orleans, there were more freed Africans than there were enslaved Africans. And at the heart of that was that language, the language of the drum that brought Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans together. Some people want to think that drum circles emerged out of the 60s. They emerged out of 1760. That's how old this experiment of group drumming is in North America. And that's why it's important that at the heart of the American experience, we can share with the next generations that we have had an experiment of equity, inclusion, and equality, okay? And in that inclusive experience, the greatest gifts of music evolved. Where would the world be without the drum kit, huh? Where would it be? We wouldn't have rock and roll, we wouldn't have jazz. Man, we wouldn't have the Beatles. Come on, people. It's important that we educate ourselves on these things because believe me, the eradication of history is not in the past. It's happening right now. It's happening as I speak to you. They are trying to eliminate that history. And it's voices like mine that raise up that history and let us know that there's a place for all of us, regardless of our skin tone. How crazy that is, that only certain groups of people get to drum. You know, all the good things that came out of the woke movement, the idea of this produced idea of cultural appropriation. Oh my goodness. Me playing an African drum next to a person playing a Native American drum is culturally appropriating. Come on, people, I am not your enemy. I am not the enemy. The enemy does not look like a person playing a drum in the park. But this is the reality of the distortion of this illusion that has really created so much separation, mind you, that we must arm ourselves with the truth of the history of drumming. Because the heartbeat of Mother Earth is a powerful heartbeat that pumps life into the earthling and systematically removes you from the illusion that you are not connected to this earth. Every single one of you here is indigenous to this planet. Every single one of you is. Your ancestors, the DNA of your ancestors, the DNA of you is the mountains from where your people came from, the water from where your people came from, the fires that they gathered themselves around. That's all woven into your DNA. You know, we go out to the park and they keep us on these little paths. Because they say we don't want to create any kind of distortion in the environment. You see? But there was a time when we were literally the nurturers of the environment. Did you know that they can take these pictures of the Amazon and they can see where the hand of the human being created the trees and the foods and helped that area to thrive instead of die? Now we all know that these medicines are calling us back to that space. If you haven't, keep using them. I promise you, you will find Mama Gaia in the voice of that medicine. Because she wants you to remember. She wants you to remember that you have a place in the circle. And that we all must be a part of the circle if we're ever going to truly heal. If we're ever going to truly transform and live in relationship again, we have to show up. And I want to thank all of you for showing up today. You could be at home watching Netflix, you know, eating potato chips. But instead you made a decision to come out. You know, and when you come out and you support the community, guess what? You're the person that benefits the most. But don't ever forget the person that benefits the second most. You know who that is? Everybody else, right? Everybody else. Because you know something? We're all going through something, am I right? I said we're all going through something, am I right?
Yeah.
And you know what? It's a lot easier when we go through it together. It really is. And it's not easy right now. It's not easy for anybody. Anywhere you look to the education system. You look to the religious. The government. You know? Medical. It's difficult. But in this right here, we have something beautiful. We have relationship. And learning to live in relationship is powerful. I guess that's about all I got, huh? Let's see. How much time do I have? Do I have more time?
Yeah, you can do some questions.
All you want.
Okay. You open to some questions?
Maybe. Let's see. Maybe I could talk about drumming a little more, huh?
Sure.
Would you guys like that?
Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
All right. So, I facilitated roughly 5,000 wellness-based events in a variety of different spaces. And one of my favorite places that I facilitate drum circles is in memory care. In fact, today I did 2 circles in memory care. And you know, oftentimes we'll go into these institutions and we'll set the drums in front of the elders, and the nurses will come over and they'll say, "Oh, she won't play." And they'll move the drum. And you know what I say? Just keep it there. It looks better for the pictures. And next thing you know, you see this, where the foot starts tapping, and then before you know it, they're moving their hands, and then they're singing along. And I've seen this time and time again. It's so powerful to understand how beautiful music is and why it's important. In the traditional language, the word for singer and the word for healer are synonymous. That'll give you a window into the power of music. Because the medicine was activated through the songs. In fact, sometimes if you talk to elders, they'll say, "Well, we don't mess with that alcohol over there because we don't know the song that goes with it." You see, because the medicinal value is the energetic manifestation and displacement. The container is always full. Right? Looks like somebody did a good job on their Kava. But that container is still full. It's full of air. Right? So in order for the manifestation to happen, something needs to be displaced. In order for us to have a beautiful kratom drink, we have to displace the air inside of the container. And that's what the energy of the song and the drum and the dance does. It displaces the energy of sickness. I've seen this happen in some of the most dense places of the human condition. Psychiatric lockdowns, memory care, skilled nursing communities. I went into a psychiatric lockdown, 4 doors I had to go through to get to the people. I sat in there and I started drumming. And this woman comes over and sits down almost on my lap. And she starts singing with me. The activity coordinator came over and whispered in my ear, "Don't worry about her. She's a wanderer." That's what she said to me. She called this woman a wanderer. That was a medical term, apparently. So I'm playing with this woman, and she starts singing some songs with me. Next thing you know, I see the activity coordinator jump up. This is the person that hired me to come to this hospital. She runs out of the hospital, out of the room, and she now has the director of nursing and the administrator, and they're in the hallway watching me and this woman sing some Grateful Dead songs. After I'm done, she grabs a hold of me and she says, "Andrew, you don't know what just happened." I said, "Yeah, that was pretty rad." She goes, "I've worked here for 7 years, and that woman has never sat through one activity." You know, for 7 years, that woman wandered around that place. You know what I mean? 7 years, and maybe she was out there at a show and took too much of something and found her way into that place. You know, and for 7 years she didn't have a human experience. You know what I mean? That's the reality of the institutional medical system we're in today. Things like this happen. One time I was doing a drum circle and I was talking about community, and there was a woman who was wheeling her mom by this assisted living group. And I didn't know that she was wheeling her mom by it, but I would later find out through an email that her mom was crying every day. She was in this assisted living community. She had lost her husband. She was very lonely. And every day she would cry. And her daughter was really perplexed, feeling the pain of her mom crying. She had to go home. She had to leave mom there. So she went to the doctor and she asked the doctor, "Doctor, give my mom something to help her." And the doctor said, "Yeah, I can give your mom something, but you won't have your mom anymore." And that's the reality of the world we're living in today. That is a solution for grief. That is a solution for grief. Do you understand what I'm saying? To literally dissolve the human being into a substance.
Quick question. Have you ever worked with hospice groups? Or?
I have, and I'll share one of those passing stories with you. It's a great question. So I'm drumming and I'm talking about community with this group. And I say, you know, when you walked into this retirement community, your life didn't end. For maybe some of you, it began. And there's people that are just like you here for their first week, and you know what? They're scared. And when you show them a smile, they feel a little bit of comfort. And let this be a place that you can be useful. Let this be a place that you can show up for community, and you can do something to help others. And you know, I got an email from that woman's mom. Or I'm sorry, from the daughter of the mom. And she said that my mom heard that message, and the next day she came out and played bingo. And then the day after she was doing balloon toss. And then the day after she was doing sing-along. And this was during the time when it was lockdown, open. So I didn't get to go back to that place. But for the next 3 months, her life changed with a simple message of community involvement. You know, community is so important. And at the center of community, for tens of thousands of years, has been the heartbeat of the drum. Right up here on Bell Road, I go to this place off the 51. And for 10 years I went to this place. And for 10 years this man would come out. And his hands were so atrophied, they were like claws. Trying to stop saying that because it's not the best thing to say about a human being. His hands were like this. And I'd open his hands up and put the maraca in his hand. And he'd shake it and say, "Hallelujah, hallelujah." Well, one day I came and I set up the drums and I said, "Where's my buddy Vance at?" This man's name is Vance Gribbins. And they told me he went home to heaven. And I said, "Well, good for him." I said, "I've been coming to this hospital for 10 years. I said, "How long did he live here?" And you know something? They told me he lived there for 28 years, you guys. 28 years he lived in that hospital, in a 90-pound body, in a bed. And he still came out and supported his community. You know, when I think about staying home, which is a lot because I have a relationship to depression, when I think about staying home, I think about him and how he came out of his room. And you know something? He had courage. That man is a hero. A hero. He had to be wheeled out in a bed to participate in his community. But he still did every single time I was there. You know, when you see people in that condition, I promise you, it will bring you a state of gratitude, an elevated state of gratitude. And there's so much opportunity to get involved in volunteering and helping our elders. So many of our elders are lonely. So your hospice question. So I got invited one time to do a passing, and it was for a man we called Dennis the Menace. This was at a memory care. And he was always kind of being crazy. And he had 2 daughters that would show up and drum with us, and they were great. They would sing La Bamba and all of the fun songs we sang really loud. So anyway, he was passing, and they invited me to go there, and I brought my friend Tom. And I did a little drumming on the frame drum, and then I asked Tom to give me the flute. And I closed my eyes, and I was playing the flute, and I seen a little flame in the wind flickering like this. And then that disappeared, and this was all in my mind's eye. And then I seen a small flower that had yellow in the center and white petals, and it was in a huge green field, and the flower was vibrating with the wind. And then that disappeared, and I seen his room, and next to him were 2 huge, like, Lord of the Rings angels. These things had like gladiator faces on and swords. And then that went away, and it was back to that little flame. And then I heard someone say, "He's gone, honey." And I opened up my eyes, and the daughter was laid over Dennis, crying. And after that, probably for about 2 weeks, I would have these psychic impressions of people, and I would feel something from them. And it was very challenging for me not to say things to them, you know? So I decided that doing end-of-life care was something that brought a lot of energy into my world, and was maybe challenging for me to practice. So I haven't done very much of it. I did another one time at a cancer facility. I washed this guy's feet and hands, and I played the flute for him. He got out of his wheelchair in my mind's eye and started dancing with a dragon. And I was like, whoa, what is this? I was still kind of in my headspace that dragons were something maybe a little bit from the pit of hell kind of thing. So I got a little freaked out, right? And I remember all of my spirit guides kind of showing up in my mind's eye, protecting me. And then I remember I opened my eyes up and I looked at him and I said, "You know, what do you think about dragons?" And he goes, "I always wondered why Americans are so afraid of dragons." He said, "I traveled all over the world and dragons were always something beautiful." And he said to me, "But you know what the dragon really reminds me of? Reminds me of my wife." And his wife had passed that year. And I said, "Well, soon you're going to be dancing with the dragon." And he just looked up and smiled at me. These are the kind of things I get to experience, you know, in the line of work that I do. One time I was working in a school, and it was a charter school in Chandler, South Chandler. It's pretty rough. And so they invited us in to do this drum circle, and I do a bullying program for schools where I talk about the feelings associated with bullying, and we do something called EMO, energy moving out through expression. So I asked a group of people, "Could somebody play for me the way they felt when they seen a friend get bullied?" So the students play, and then I go deeper. Can somebody play for me the way they felt when they were bullied? Now, this is a group of teenagers, and it gets real quiet. So quiet that you could hear a mouse squeak. It's really intense. And nobody's playing. But I know in that moment something very magical is about to happen. And this young person put their hands on the drum and pulled them away like it was red hot. And I pointed at them and I said, "Would you like to play?" And they looked at me and said, "No, I can't play." But then all of the youth started encouraging this young person. Have you all witnessed how these youth are coming in with so much emotional intelligence? That they have so much emotional intelligence inside of them that's really underneath a lot of trauma. But once you're able to get connected with it, it's like they're so much more advanced than we were in the 90s anyway. So I said to them, it's okay. Everyone starts encouraging them. The person's name was Little Bit. Little bit, you can play. Little bit, you can do it. So they put their hands on the drum and they start expressing. And it goes from this very, very gentle sound to a very pronounced scream on the drum. And as they're playing, tears are falling from their eyes. And I remember sitting in that and experiencing the little boy inside of me that was dealing with PTSD as a little boy, being bullied in school and being hurt and rejected by family, and all of these things were coming forward, and I was choking back the tears. And after they were done, I said, is it okay if I ask the group what they felt? And they looked at me and they nodded. And I said, would anyone like to share what they felt? And the whole school started saying, I felt angry, I felt alone. All of these words start coming up. And then across from them is this young man. And he starts saying a whole bunch of words. And now Little Bit and this young man are looking at each other, nodding. And he's saying this whole litany of feelings. So after we're done, I say, thank you so much. And I say, we're all going to rumble our feelings in association with bullying. And everybody rumbles, and we kind of expel that. And then we're picking up the drums, and the principal comes over to me and says, that was the most amazing thing. Thank you so much for that. I said, yeah, that was really powerful. And the principal says to me, they're the exact reason why we invited you. He's been picking on them the whole year. And in that moment, there was a deep connection and a transformation. Very, very powerful. That's the ancestral wisdom that's in the drum. And if we can get beyond these ideas of who gets to play the drum, who's worthy of playing the drum, we all can experience those things. And we can all live in better relationship with the earth. For tens of thousands of years, the drum has been used to create and fortify a metaphysical architecture. That metaphysical architecture is associated with something that we call an entity. Entities are an agreement, right? Like a business entity. Like if we agree to create a business, we create a business entity. Well, the institutions of medicine that we have today, they're agreements. But unfortunately, the institution of medicine has created a fortification of the energy of sickness. And in that energy of sickness, there's a gravity. For instance, if we were all holding a blanket, and I dropped a bowling ball into the middle of the blanket, and then we all had marbles in our mouth, and we spit out our marbles and lost our marbles, where would the marbles go? They would go to the bowling ball, exactly. Because the bowling ball has created a density within the fabric of reality. You see, that's how it is when we agree. When we agree with each other, we create a metaphysical architecture. That metaphysical architecture can be fortified through the always, never, have to, need to, must statements. Those statements inside of us are going someplace, and they're going to the fortification of that energetic architecture. Now, for tens of thousands of years, the drum has been used to break up the density and to create something with that density. Once we're able to access the density of human suffering through the power of empathy, which is something people today believe is actually bad. You guys heard that? Isn't that crazy? There was a certain businessman that created an electrical vehicle that said this. I'm not going to invite them to the table, but you know who I'm talking about. That empathy is bad, but empathy is actually the tool that you can use to access the density of human suffering within yourself and within others. Why is it important to be able to access that? Because you can become an alchemist. Have any of you ever experienced a person with bad vibes? Oh, you get around that person and you think, man, they're so negative, right? Well, here's the reality of that. Negative energy is energy that we refuse to alchemize. Dense energy has potential. Has anybody ever made a fire? Yeah? Has anybody ever used fire to stay warm?
Yeah.
Okay. So what burns longer, oak or pine? Oak does. And the reason it burns longer is because it has more density. Density has potential. You see, the suffering that's within all of us is the emotional density that can create a potential for transformation once we give ourselves the courage to access that density. Now, these energetic entities, they can also be accessed. And I can share with you that we play a rhythm of love and gratitude once we've accessed the density of human suffering inside of these institutions of medicine. And sometimes these places smell so bad, I have to come home and take my clothes off in the garage. But if we get into the right frequency, and I'm not talking about megahertz, okay? I'm talking about consciousness and connection to sound. When we apply consciousness to sound, we can create a vehicle for transforming the density of suffering into something that serves us. Sometimes an aroma of roses will come through the center of the circle. And it's said that when holy people walk through crowds, that there's an aroma that follows them. Not saying that I create this holiness, but I'm saying inside of the container of the drum circle, that sense of holiness is present because of the agreement of love. The same as the catalyst for the alchemist, the prophet, the sage, the healer, the shaman. All of those people are alchemizing the energy of density within the crowd to create something beautiful. These are energetic principles that can be applied to your life in the way that you relate to energy. You have to get yourself out of the illusion of negative energy in order to access the density. In order to access the density of human suffering, we must be courageous enough to look at energy as potential rather than something we discard. Because if we discard it, we can fortify it through creating a space of rejection. Does that make sense? Yeah? It's a little bit different idea of energy, right? That all energy has potential. Anyway, I share that with you because I care about you, you know. You may experience entities inside of your psychedelic experiences. These entities could be fortifications of have to, need to, must statements that your mind has created through years of struggling with issues inside of your own consciousness. When you experience them, realize that they are simply potential for a catalyst for your greatest self-awareness, rather than rejecting them and fortifying the continuation of the karmic consequences of that entity. Now, entities have also been used through drumming, singing, and dancing to do a variety of things within the human condition, including heal the sick. These are angelic, used to create the optimal warrior, used to create the harvest. These are why rhythms have always been associated with specific necessities within the collective. The rhythm of the drum is played for a certain thing that is needed to be done. That rhythm fortifies a creative entity. The entity then goes out into the metaphysical within the world of energy and creates an outcome. So why do I utilize love and gratitude? Because love and gratitude is the optimal source of creative force for all of humanity. There's a difference in the agreement when it's strategic. Like, for instance, the West African rhythm Kakilambe. Kakilambe is a rhythm that fortifies the deity of the forest, specifically to help the people. When Kakilambe manifests, Kakilambe speaks an esoteric language that only a shaman can interpret. But the manifestation of that entity is done through the drum, the song, and the agreement of the collective. These are principles within the macro understanding of the earth-based consciousness that are very powerful for the contemporary timeline. That's all I got to say about that. Anybody have any questions? Yes.
The first part where you were talking, I'm not sure I quite got it. But
Sure.
One of the things that was resonated with me is you said I introduced myself to the river. So when you introduce yourself to the river, what does that sound like?
That sounds like introducing my parents and my grandparents, my place of birth and my place of residence. So this is me really connecting to the river in an intimate way. You know, creating a idea within my mind that that river is a relative of mine, a distant relative that I haven't met, and I want to be in relationship with the river.
And part of that is including your ancestral background.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
And specifically, sometimes it's just the names of my grandparents. Sometimes it's using my traditional language. It all depends on what's going on within my life at that point.
So the introducing yourself, that part kind of makes sense to me. The ancestral part, I hear it a lot. I hear about S5, I hear about that. But you're talking, I don't, that part of it just doesn't resonate.
Of course, yeah.
You got an idea on what?
Well, we've been institutionally created to understand that our behaviors are our self-identity rather than our family. And this idea is very prominent in our world. You know, for someone to say that I am my parents, I am my grandparents, this is a very ancient technology of self-identity that was way before the institutions of patriarchy, feudalism, and manneralism. See, those three institutions really have created a foundation for the disconnect from the earth-based identity, the familial-based identity, into a reality where your whole value is created about what you can do for the institution. And that inherent value is so woven into us that the idea of our ancestors becomes something, why? It's a question, why? Like, why would I want to think about my family? But what I would like to share with you is that for tens of thousands of years, your ancestors introduced themselves that way. And it's only been several hundred years that they have forgotten that. But yet that several hundred years has created a profound impact on the social, economic, and structures of our world. And it's like literally the air we breathe. But yet if you think about every spiritual philosophy around the world has some merit to the idea of honoring your parents. It's kind of inherent within the philosophy of it. But yet we've gotten away from that. In fact, even in Asian cultures, even in Buddhist cultures, generally if you go over to these individuals' homes, they'll have a picture of their grandparents on the wall in which they're burning incense to them. Now, is that specifically within the association to their Buddhism? It's a part of it, but it's so pragmatic that for many of us, when we look at ideas of Buddhism or Taoism, we don't even recognize it, that that's actually a part of the merit of the individual. Now, when you talk about past lives, those things are very important as well, but I'm not talking about past lives. I'm talking about your life today, your parents, your grandparents, your family, and that being important to your ceremonial introduction. Now, does that necessarily need to be your biological parents? Maybe not. Maybe it's a person that represented a feminine aspect to you that you would want to call in for your mom. Maybe it's a person that represented a masculine aspect to you that you would want to call in for your dad. But that idea of the feminine, the masculine, and the child is also a very powerful form of consciousness. And it's really the triangle. You know, within sacred geometry, like the rigidity of a triangle is a very strong form of geometry. In fact, it creates pyramids that last through time. Does that make a little more sense? Or?
Yeah, but yeah, not with what you were just saying, but I understand it better. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah.
I think it speaks to the fact of, you know, we've really forgotten as a society where we came from, and letting go of that first stage of it, just your parents and your grandparents, is such a monumental, you know, loss for all of us, because you know, our history is so convoluted, and we've been taught that this was what happened and this was what happened, even though it's all bullshit, and nobody knows the real story because we've been told by, you know, well, the winners tell the story, so, you know, that's how it goes. But holding on to that little piece where your introduction is where you come from immediately, your family,
Yes.
is a powerful way to get back to learning the history again.
And then what if your child could sit with the fire burning in their eyes of your favorite place in nature and introduce themselves as you? You see how much fortification of the integrity of the family would happen in that. You know, but we don't have these ceremonial spaces. We don't have a space where we could sit in nature and have our children introduce themselves to a fungus and listen to them introduce themselves as you. You see?
Yeah.
But inside of that ceremonial container, the fortification of the resilience of your child being enough because they're your offspring. That's enough. Without them being an educated doctor or a lawyer or anything. Just that they're enough, just being an earthling. The power of that integrity is something that transforms whole relational dynamics. And then also within that is a responsibility model. Because the truth of that scientific model is based around the responsibility of your sister's children being yours as well. Because you're the second dad in that model. Your sister's children, you're their dad as well. And they may introduce you as their dad. You see, and that integrity creates a disconnect from the association of the institution. Because every form of education that we have today is held by an institution. Therefore, the structure of that is contained within it. And we can't question anything outside of the institution because they may take our piece of paper from us. You see how this is woven into the fabric of our reality? It's so woven into there that it's literally a question of, why does this matter? And that's what I get all the time. Why does this matter? And, you know, I think that the tens of thousands of years of fortified communities that have lived in peaceful coexistence with the planet is enough for us to question, well, what were they doing? Maybe there's something in that we can do today. Maybe something we can apply to our lives today. Hope that makes sense. Yeah.
I was really thanking for coming and sharing. Appreciate you sharing your story and all of that too. I thought it was really interesting what you shared about growing up and how cannabis affected your family compared to other substances. So curious kind of maybe how that's relationship with that plant has gone throughout your adult life, and especially more specifically as you sound like you transitioned from maybe not as healthy medicine use to now more intentional health medicine use. Like what kind of caused that shift, or what did that? I'm just curious what that kind of how that shift happened for you.
It's a great question. So, cannabis has been something that I've used medicinally in my relationship to sobriety. So I've used it as a pain relief substance, primarily high CBD cannabis. But for me, something about the ritual of inhaling cannabis has been something very medicinal to me as well. Today, it's been over almost 10 years since I've used any. And, well, I take that back. I've used a couple gummies, like within that period, where I just thought my cannabinoid system might be low and I need to reactivate it. So I used some gummies. But the last time that I came to a place of recognizing my relationship with cannabis was really understanding that this medicine is a relative of mine. And that's the way I looked at tobacco too. That I can talk to this medicine and I can say to the medicine, well, what is it you want to teach me? Are we good? Do I need to be with you? You know, have you taught me everything that I need to know? Because I'm kind of feeling like we're, growing apart. And then she just let me go. Like it was just like, okay, it's time. And it was very easy. Now, tobacco, on the other hand, was something that was really a challenge for me. And I would have thoughts of, I should use some tobacco. And then I'm a didgeridoo player, or I play a homthon, which is a very ancient Mayan horn. very similar to the didgeridoo, and I started feeling like a little bit of stress in my lungs. So I just said to the tobacco, you know, I feel better with clean air in my lungs every time I would think about using tobacco, and then that relationship shifted too. So like the idea of living in relationship with the plants, introducing yourself to the plants, like asking them permission, talking to them as if they're, you know, a person, like these are things that are important for us to realize that have been a part of our collective experience with these medicines for tens of thousands of years. You know, the idea of, you know, introducing yourself to the river is a part of that. You know, these mountains had names in our ancestral history because they were relative of ours. You know, like we talk to the earth. Like it's okay to do that. It's actually strange that we don't talk to the earth. You know, think about that for a second. You know, what is that saying? The people who danced looked crazy to those that couldn't hear the music. You know, I love that. You know, that's like the life that I live today. I hear the music. You know, I hear it in the whisper of the wind. I hear it in the song of the bird. I might think about something and a bird will fly in front of me. Now, I'm not going to Google to figure out what that bird means. I'm thinking about what was the causality of my consciousness that created that. You see? The bird flying by is a part of the narrative of my mind. My mind is creating a story that is being impacted by the world around me. And that's that macro view of what it means to really live in that frequency of living as a shamanic practitioner or a spiritual practitioner, living in a world that has more meaning to it than just the surface of this reality. Yeah. So, you know, all about relationship with that medicine. Beautiful medicine, live in relationship with it. And that's, you know, also just as important with ibuprofen. You know, 3 out of 10 people are healed with a sugar pill, right? Do you know that that goes up significantly when we talk about antidepressants and antipsychotic medicines? Did you know it's in the 60 and 70 percentile of placebo effect and even nocebo effect of these medicines? So what would it be like if we really created relationship with the substance we use in our lives? Would we be able to sit under the water of the shower and say, thank you, water, for cleansing my depression, and have our depression wash down the drain? Could we live in a frequency where that was possible? You know, I've heard elders talk about how they prayed with water, not to water, but with the water, and have that water heal cancer with water. This is the power of living in relationship. When you truly live in relationship, that which you call upon can make a difference in your life. You know the saying of there was a man who wanted to buy a convertible, you know, so he could feel the wind through his hair. Spent all of his life working to feel the wind through his hair. And all he really needed to do was roll down the window. You know? You know? And then there's the guy that calls on the wind, right? Says blow, and the wind blows. You know? I don't know. I want to be like that. I want to call on the wind. All right, how's everybody doing? Good? Feel pretty full? Good message?
Yeah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Appreciate it.
Where do we find you?
You all can get a free copy of my book, The Sacred Seven. If you just go to thesacred7, all spelled out.com, and you can get a free copy. It'll cost you an email, and then you'll get a PDF copy and 8 guided imagery meditations associated with each one of the containers of self-identity. So me represents the inner child, my mom represents the feminine, my dad represents the masculine, my mother's mother represents the fullness of me, focused on the feminine, the masculine, and the child. Or my grandma, I'm sorry, on my mom's side. My father's mother represents who I am to my family. My mother's father represents who I am to community. And my father's father represents who I am to the elements. This is all a part of the book. And also a deeper dive into my history of unpacking substance use disorder and other mental health concerns. And hopefully, you know, it gives you a good hope for your life and how you can incorporate ceremonial introduction into your practice of plant medicines. So free copy of the book. Also, we have a training coming up in Sedona, November 14th through the 16th. It's going to be an awesome 3 days of transformational drumming, sound medicine, drum building. All of you are invited. I don't know if there's an email list. I can send a 10% off discount for that training.
Okay, yeah, you can give it
Sweet.
to me, I'll get it out to everyone.
Sweet, yeah, and I did speak at the 2019 Arizona Psychedelic Conference. I think that was a different
Yeah, it's a
association.
different one, too.
Yeah,
Awesome.
but I'd be open to doing a drum circle at the conference too. However I could support, so. All right, thanks everybody.
All right. Well, next week I think we're doing just a social gathering, hangout, whatever. I'll be fresh off a plane, but I'll come. We'll see you guys then.